Hi, welcome to Politics for People Who Hate Politics, episode 5, if I'm not mistaken. I have a slightly weird panel, but that weird is probably a good thing this evening. We have ever stalwart Joe Steigerwald, of course, my brother, who is an okay person, I guess. And we also have Michael Tracy, who is a correspondent for Vice, and he's also written some stuff for the American Conservative and The Nation and Reason and other good stuff. So it's exciting to have him here. He's not officially libertarian, but I won't label him anything else because that would be, but we like him anyway. And we also have Joshua M. Patton, a Pittsburgher who I know in real life, and he wanted to be introduced as a writer for the internet, which is an incredibly vague introduction, but an accurate one nonetheless. Thanks for being on the panel tonight, gentlemen, bearded gentlemen.
Thanks for having me. Hello.
Okay, we had I had tailored my half-assed schedule a little bit more to some more libertarian-centric topics, but it's probably better to branch out a little. Like, I was going to talk about how Ron Paul's totally going to be in the final chapter of the Atlas Shrugged movie, which I haven't ever read or seen any of those movies, but that's still funny.
Talk about the trilogy, right?
Yeah, it's a really long book, and they recast it every time, which is super weird.
And it gets horrible reviews.
Yeah.
It'll be an embarrassment to everyone.
I kind of want to watch it for Ron Paul, though, and for many jokes about how it's happening. .gif. But that's not important, right? I mean, it is important, but it's also not. We could talk about depressing things like Obama sending advisors to Iraq, because no wars ever started with sending advisors to a foreign country. But we could talk about something a little more of an optimistic and good thing, which is that last night the House passed what looks to be a better step towards NSA reform, such as it is, than the very toothless USA Freedom Act that passed, I now forget when, like last month or so. And the new thing is actually intended to, which hasn't passed in the Senate or anything like that, but it's intended to cut off funding in the NSA's efforts to make various technologies. Michelle Montalvo, better late than never.
Hey, I'm on my phone.
We're doing it live, ladies and gentlemen. All right, well, at least I'm not the only one without a beard. Michelle,
Are we live right now?
We are. We have no viewers, though, so I wouldn't worry about it.
Oh, wonderful. Okay.
Michelle Montalvo meets Michael Tracy and Joshua Patton.
Hello, Michael and Josh.
Hello.
All right, I got one more libertarian to back me up here. Well, anyway, gents and lady, NSA reform. It also I'm all over the place today. This isn't.
I'm gonna leave now, Lucy. This is unacceptable.
All right, NSA reform. Okay, here's a really wide question not related to the bill, in case we haven't been paying attention, or like me, can't retain enough information to talk about it without having an article in front of us. Is NSA reform actually a thing that's happening? And even if it does it actually matter? Because won't the FBI and the DEA and local police just spy on us all anyway? So, is it possible? And if so, how would we go about it? Give me some words on the NSA, ladies and gentlemen.
Well, I mean, I definitely think the tech industry has coalesced very strongly behind at least putative reforms. So you've seen, massive PR campaigns waged by Facebook and Google and others to kind of get to marshal industry support behind these things. So you'd have to think that the measures therefore have some degree of weight to them if these huge economic players are deploying so many resources behind lobbying for them. So I think that matters to a degree. But there are just so many. I mean, law enforcement across the country is just so disparate and disconnected that it's hard to have any kind of comprehensive analysis of what kind of surveillance they're implementing. So it's wholly separate from whatever reforms happen on the federal level.
Right, yeah, I mean that's part of the problem is just the setup of our government itself with you would need state and federal reforms. But I mean, do you guys have any sense of what the best angle is to try to stop this? It's one of those things where I feel sort of immediately exhausted, like immediately pessimistic about the chances of fixing this. Kind of like whenever war drums start, and I'm like, well, if you're going to war, you're going to do it, and there's nothing I can do, which is a bad attitude, but.
Well, I don't know about what specific angle they might take, because again, I don't know enough about like what computery shit is possible, what isn't. But I do think that if there is going to be change, it might have a good chance of happening this year because it is a midterm year, and it is a very popular issue. No one really likes the NSA right now. So if somehow that were to become a certain group of candidates currently in Congress, running for re-election, who like their constituents make a big deal about it, they might try to do some last-minute push something through in order to have a political victory right before the election. And again, whether that ends up having any teeth or being effective, there's really no way to know until. I mean, there's actually no way to know unless another Snowden comes out and says yes, they did, or that they didn't.
I think the public is enough against a lot of these bills that I think it goes back to Cantor lost in part because he was seen as this kind of statist, and with this new bill, they do a voice vote before it actually happens to see Congress. Basically, off the record, will vote, and it didn't pass on the voice vote. When they actually did the vote, it passed because no one wants to go on the record now being for the NSA because they know it's political poison at this point.
Is it really? I mean,
I think it is on the conservative side.
Yeah, and
I think all over. I mean, liberals themselves love Glenn Greenwald and Edward Snowden. These are two guys who have sort of transcended the ideological teams that people, like it's fucking sports. It's people seem to care about it. However, if with the stuff happening in Iraq, if anything even sounds like terrorism outside of the Middle East is happening related to ISIS or really at all, I think that the opinion will change for a lot of people who have typically been on the national security side of things.
Another point about kind of the local surveillance measures that are being enacted, I think we have reason to believe at this point, a few case studies basically reflecting this, that, oftentimes what happens is that police departments or other kind of law enforcement agencies will try to usher in these new technologies used for surveillance kind of underhandedly, or it's not put up for public debate.
Like with the stingrays, have you looked into that?
Yeah, that would be an example of it. But I think there's evidence in various locations around the country that when committed journalists or activists call attention to these actual measures and the amount of money being spent on them and how they seem to be being instituted without proper oversight from the local council or whatever the legislative body is, I think there's definitely an opportunity for people on a local level to kind of marshal support for at least applying greater scrutiny to these initiatives. I think Radley Balco has even reported on local backlash to certain militarization initiatives in certain departments. It's just about creating the awareness, because police departments by design will do it with pretty little fanfare or by bureaucratic mechanisms, so their decisions aren't subject to direct electoral oversight.
Mm-hmm. So Jello Biafra of the Dead Kennedys, I believe one of his many campaign platforms when he ran for governor of California back in the late 70s was that police officers should have to run for office, which I always thought was an interesting idea. Not that it would really solve anything. That's true. Yeah, that's true. Um, but yeah, sorry, I had a Gel Biafra related tangent that went nowhere, but that happens in my life. I keep I keep wondering if one thing that we don't have, like I don't want to pretend that I trust the Constitution to fix everything by any means, and I think that out of all the Bill of Rights, the Fourth Amendment is probably one of the most destroyed at this point. But part of the problem is that so many of our laws have not caught up with our technology. So many of our computer laws that are used to legalize spying have not caught up. And I know I should be skeptical about like, the magical fix everything about spying law of, 2016, but I wonder if there's anything there that can actually like it just needs something that needs to exactly state like you may not spy on these people, without a really particular warrant or something like that.
But
I don't, it's just something really basic without the caginess, without the sort of, oh, well, we need more loopholes for this loophole and that sort of thing. I mean, I don't know.
would you really trust the government to actually enforce itself regardless?
Oh, no,
I mean,
no.
if they can get away with it, they're going to get away with it.
That's why, hence the pessimism.
Right.
It's hard to conceive what a simple law or directive like that would even look like, because there's just so much case law already on the books governing what kind of surveillance is allowable and when.
You're right. Yeah.
That and that you can't overturn it with even one decision because it's so kind of multifarious.
Mm-hmm.
And you'd probably really have to. The only fix would be to totally cut off the budgets of pretty much as many agencies as you can.
That's why doing it approaching it from a local standpoint is useful, because you can actually narrow down, what mechanisms are being put in place to carry out this surveillance, and you can more kind of directly trace the origins of it and take action that way, rather than trying to kind of come up with a holistic remedy that probably wouldn't be applicable in so many instances.
Yeah, that's probably true. It just seems like it's. I was just hoping for some kind of easy fix.
No, we're screwed.
I like some of the weasel moves that have been at least theorized, like that they should cut off the water for the ginormous NSA compound in
Oh yeah,
Utah, where like in about 12 hours their computers would overheat, and I assume the place would burn to the ground.
Environmental activists on this one? They finally have a role to play. They can't step up.
That's true.
I saw a tweet this week from environmental activists or someone of that orientation who was were planning on doing something like that. I think there are environmental leaning people who had that in the works, but that could just be me conjuring up a false memory.
Possibly. Yeah, I know. Like the 10th Amendment Center, I think in California was talking about this. People who were trying to, who are not environmentalists, clearly. So we're all doomed. Got it. Fourth Amendment's dead, in spite of my shirt.
Cross it off. Just cross it off. Just start crossing off the amendments.
Crossing it off now. All right. Right now we're going to talk a little bit about Michael Tracy's article for Vice about heroin, and I'm going to ask him to lay it out a little bit, and then maybe the rest of us can join in. Michael Tracy, can you give us a summation of your article? Or I can do it, but...
Why don't you give me a couple sentences and I'll kind of riff from there.
Okay. Basically, Tracy was talking about how there has been a bit of a panic lately in various places about an increase in heroin use in the United States. And in other places, they have theorized that this increase might be due to crackdowns on prescription drug abuse, because if you can't get your opiates one way, you're going to get them another. But basically, Tracy heroin panic. Why is this silly? And is there actually an increase in heroin lately in the United States?
Yeah. So one of the contrasts I try to bring out in detail is that we have this kind of sense, at least in the journalistic kind of realm, and especially on the libertarian-leaning realm, that there's been a consciousness shift on drug policy, and that people, especially of our generation roughly have achieved this kind of enlightenment with respect to the epic and endless failures of drug prohibition, and that going forward we're going to take on a more compassionate, treatment-based approach and move away from carceral punishment, which everyone knows from every political persuasion now pretty much agrees is swell the prisons at enormous expense and not produce anything good and just wrought untold misery on the populace. So everyone agrees that it's terrible, and yet we have right now, even in just the last week, it's been amazing, following this, a number of really punitive criminalization measures that have sailed through state legislatures in Jersey, New York. New York in particular had a big to-do over this past week with Governor Cuomo coming out and supporting it. So it just, just broadly, it seems like there's, we see the signs of the emergence of this hysteria that has very distinct echoes of drug scares of the past, like crack in the 80s, heroin in the 70s, and those scares, manifested ultimately in horrible public policy. So the point of calling attention to this now is to kind of preempt some of the wrong-headed policy that seems to be seeping its way into inaction. And one of the ways that this, and I also go into the piece, these policies are generally justified by proponents on the basis of there being a, quote, heroin epidemic in the country, which is always vaguely defined by people who are referencing it. And also that, we need this to help to save the children, the classic trope.
Always.
Right. But so this is doubly ironic because just about a week, it was last Friday, so a week ago today, the CDC, which is the U.S. government's authority on public health data, released its report for opiate use in 2013, showing that use of heroin among teenagers in the U.S. declined, I think it was 0.6% from 2011 to 2013. So by no meaningful metric can one state with any certitude that there is a heroin, quote, epidemic, especially among U.S. teens in the country, and yet the supposed epidemic among U.S. teens is the primary reason why all these enforcement measures are being ramped up at this time. So you have in New York, they've doubled the size of the anti-narcotics division of the state police. In New Jersey, there was a huge sweep of basically a mass arrest in the first week of June of over 340 people, 280 of which were just heroin users only. And then their names and photos and places of residence were splashed on the internet, and it basically as a means of public humiliation.
Yeah.
I talk about this more in a forthcoming piece for Monday, but this is so there's just a lot going on right now, and I feel like it's happening. It's really consequential and significant and going to have a huge impact on a lot of people's lives, and yet the journalistic crowd seems insufficiently attuned to it. So I'm trying to...
Well, I mean, the mainstream press has never been good on the drug war until, the mainstream press is bad on actually questioning policies that are already in place, and they're easily swayed by, the opportunity for a delightfully scaremongery headline. So, I mean, I don't expect mainstream people to question the fact that there's, totally an epidemic of heroin. Yeah. They always, that's what they do. They're culpable. They're greatly culpable for the drug war's horrors as well, because they...
Yeah, and in generally, they're extraordinarily deferential to law enforcement authorities just overall. Yeah. But with respect to drugs, illicit drugs in particular, law enforcement receive even more deference because they're thought of as having unique experience and expertise on the subject of drugs, which to me is just wildly ridiculous.
As opposed to a vested interest in a particular side most of the time, among other.
Yeah, but even as young kids, we're propagandized with the DARE program and so forth, and parents are instilled with the idea that police should be educating children about the nature of certain substances. When, and I mentioned this in the piece, and I spoke to a law enforcement person directly about it. The question I had was, why are you in particular suited to speak about purported heroin epidemic, which you're calling a medical issue, to kids at the high school that we were at for like a seminar or assembly thing? Why is it you that's coming and giving these kids information when, a reasonable person might say, have a public health official or an academic or a medical professional or someone who actually has can actually discuss this through a non-criminalization prism.
Mm-hmm.
And people are so kind of entrenched in that mindset that it just seems natural to them that the police should be the ones coming in to provide educational, guidance to teenagers on heroin use, when really that's the absolute opposite of what should be happening.
Right. I mean, but for the past 40 years have made that sort of expected. We can open this discussion up a little bit. Another thing I want to add is that I've talked about kind of what Tracy wrote about in some other pieces myself, but it was mostly a general caution that I think y'all libertarians and good leftists and anyone else against the drug war, like I worry about getting too comfy. Oh, weed's legal in 2 states. We're done. Sitting back, and not only is it not over for the people who are still in prison for reasons they shouldn't be, but it's not over in 48 states about weed, and it's not over about the harder drugs that some people are much more uncomfortable, defending.
Yeah, it's going in the opposite direction.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's why.
I'd be curious just to know if anybody has just any broad reactions to my soliloquy then, or if they have any kind of input or any of their own experiences that relate to it.
Well, I remember back when Philip Seymour Hoffman died is when I started noticing a lot of heroin epidemic stories.
Mm-hmm.
And the one thing that the statistics that I remember floating around was something like, 40-45% increase in overdose deaths for like a 5-year period, and also that where these were happening, the geography was different than what the DEA was used to, which is sort of how I think it got branded an epidemic, because it does seem to be popping up in other places, probably I think because of the whole prescription drug thing.
It's spreading to white people, so now there's
right, exactly, and that's why it's an epidemic now. Holy shit! But I do think
white suburbia.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But what I think that and that's why I think that that they're having success with sort of cracking down and militarizing and stopping the bad guys, because again, the heroin dealers, even when you're having the arguments about legalizing marijuana in the other 48 states, part of the defense is always, well, I mean, it's not like it's a heroin or it's a heroin drug. And I think that if somehow that could be detached, that fear, from the actual realities of, what it's like and what it's like to the people who really have a problem with it, then people will change their minds about that they should be in jail rather than, a hospital or treatment or whatever, a wood cabin out in Walden Pond, wherever you should go when you're in the grips of the girl.
What I just read on this heroin stats was the heroin overdoses has not increased since the late 90s. It's heroin use has increased by about 50%, but the actual overdoses, what I just read on the HuffPost, you search for heroin now and you get an entire page full of panicked headlines and heroin's coming to kill us all, et cetera, et cetera. But it doesn't look like, the deaths, unintentional death overdoses are flat. And it's probably, in cases like this, a lot of the time it's just more people actually admitting that they're doing heroin, not necessarily an actual increase.
Yeah, I mean, heroin use has tended to stay very stable for a very long time. You don't see the dramatic spikes. And I don't know, I don't have good numbers in front of me, but if it's true that cracking down on prescription drug abuse and probably, just use, and that's another whole other problem, if it's true that that has pushed people, including, white college students who might have had a pill problem, into heroin, that also is an old story because invariably when the government cracks down on one substance use, people will find another one. And often it's a worse one. Like during the Vietnam War, when soldiers, getting stoned, and they cracked down on marijuana and they started using heroin, and they cracked down on heroin and they started injecting it instead of snorting it. And the coke epidemic in the 80s was partially a reaction to the fact that there was a heavy Reagan era crackdown on marijuana. Like it's at this point we should be learning that whenever the government cracks down on a substance, obviously that doesn't end substance abuse or use. It simply pushes people towards something else, which almost every occasion that I've seen is something worse. So
and whatever.
Yeah,
else.
and I mean, I think based on my understanding of the most recent data, and this is the federal government's data, heroin use has remained flat, but there's some evidence. There's evidence to just suggests, and the spokespeople say this, that heroin deaths have increased over the past few years. Now, the irony in that would be that the cause of the death would have not been due to heroin itself, as pharmacologically, it would be because it was combined with some other substance. That was the cause of Philip Seymour Hoffman's death.
That's
it wasn't
right, yeah.
a pure heroin overdose. It was that his stuff was laced. So that arises only because it happened. It has to operate in an underground market, and it can't be subject to any kind of above ground regulations or oversight or scrutiny or however you want to put it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the Philip Seymour Hoffman thing is interesting, and I mention it in another piece coming out next week, because I think it kind of typifies how people approach this issue, which is that they kind of collect a series of anecdotes about what's going on, and they form their opinion based on that, which is a very common human impulse.
Mm-hmm.
But when you're talking about public policy responses, to have your kind of view informed so heavily by anecdotal account of a celebrity dying, and then a law enforcement officer gives his anecdotal account, and then you talk to somebody else whose cousin died from it, and it becomes this like self-reinforcing bubble where people kind of it's a loop, and people now have such these staunchly held beliefs in the existence of a heroin epidemic, and no amount of data really could dissuade them from it. So thus, they're a little more likely to support wrong-headed public policy. And there's also another problem that the data is all coming from the government.
Mm-hmm.
So, and because there's no really other entity that can collect data on that scale, or at least does collect data on that scale that I've seen. So, even by the government's own data, there's no heroin epidemic among teens. And but that aside, there's such little uniformity among the sources of data that it just kind of calls into question whether we trust the methodology of these sources enough to be making public health pronouncements based on, or there's a lot of there's kind of there's a problem with that as well. So there's more to touch on.
Yeah,
oh, sorry, go ahead. I was going to say, going back to what you said before about one cracking down on one thing causes another. The government knows, they have the data, even if it is faulty. They know that they've been cracking down on prescription pills, and as prescription pill use has dropped, the heroin use has increased basically in kind.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just one of these things. They know how it's working, why it's increasing, and yet they're still going to come out with these stupid wrong-headed policies, which is just going to send them to something else, be it meth or crocodile or whatever else.
Yeah, and speaking of overhyped drug terrors, crocodile was another great one.
That one disappeared quick.
Yeah, and that existed because people couldn't get their drug of choice in Russia as well. It's the same old shit all over the world. And what pisses me off about the drug war is that suddenly it's become socially acceptable among mainstream politicians to dip a toe into legalization, medical marijuana, or maybe a little less, ridiculous police state shenanigans. But they're still going to take forever to turn around on this.
See,
And we're still going to.
Oh. Well, I was just gonna say, I don't think that anyone ever really turned around. I mean, you had the Bush years, and people just it's a political issue, of course. So Bush's DEA, they were raiding the poor medical marijuana stations, and that's messed up. And then The Wire ended, and people were, and people loved The Wire, and it was about the drug war. And then you get Obama, who's like, yeah, the drug war is bullshit. And then he comes in and he does the exact same stuff. And now the Republicans, because it's politically convenient for them, are, damn the drug war. Not because they want to legalize drugs, but because, they want to stick it to Barry. And that's the problem. No one actually cares about the prohibition part.
I mostly agree.
Yeah. An interesting trend, and an interesting rhetorical trend among the Republicans specifically, and I think Chris Christie's a good emblem for this, just because he's considered at the forefront of Republican kind of discourse, is that they've kind of come to accept that railing on social issues, quote unquote, namely gay marriage and abortion, is not always the winningest electoral strategy. So they kind of have to adopt other quote unquote social issues to expound on that will be emotionally resonant and will touch a certain chord among a certain voter that gay marriage and abortion previously had. And Christie since 2012 now has been saying that the war on drugs is quote a failure.
Mm-hmm.
And within the past couple of months, and he did this just today when he addressed the Faith and Family Freedom F and something coalition meeting, where a third of the speech is basically devoted to how the Republican Party gets fixated on these hot buttons, so-called social issues, when he thinks that compassionate conservatism and a genuine focus on social issues should extend to offering treatment to addicts, and basically he's saying a drug policy should be the Republicans' new social issue. And of course that's going to manifest in different ways according to the politician, but it's just the rhetorical trend is itself interesting because Christie's kind of calculated that he can't obviously be seen as this anti-gay rights stalwart or anti-abortion, but he needs to kind of rouse that same kind of impulse in people. So he's doing that by kind of bringing a new social issue into the foray, which is interesting.
Well, I think too that the rise of drug courts, the popularity of drug courts in the past 20 years, that emphasizes treatment over incarceration.
Drug courts are bullshit, though, too.
Fair enough. I mean, we've talked about this, but the focus is not on jail. It's on healing.
It's not. But the rhetorical focus is not on jail, but the practical impact.
Oh yeah, that's what we're talking about. I mean,
you can still ruin a life in those more feel-good measures.
So that actually makes it more pernicious that people are talking less and less about incarceration and criminalization while simultaneously ramping up those policies, because it makes people less aware that it's happening.
Right,
so at least when there were firebrands who would rail on it,
declaring the war on drugs over when it's like in 2009. Let's not call it the war on drugs anymore. The war on drugs was, the war on people, the war on poor people, the war on black people, the war on fuck all y'all if you get caught would be slightly more accurate. But the war part was really quite literal quite often. And so the fact that the former drug czar, thought it sounds too mean to call it the war on drugs, we won't call it that anymore, it actually annoyed me more just for the reasons that Tracy said, because it's false. It's hiding the truth that there's still all of this coercion involved and all of this social engineering involved.
Well, I mean, you could imagine someone saying, I'm a Republican governor of one of the most populous states in the country. I personally believe that the war on drugs has failed, but given the exigencies of my duties as chief executive of the state, I have to carry out certain elements of the drug war just as a matter of practical necessity. So that would be at least defensible in a sense.
Eh.
But in terms of but not if you're simultaneously ramping up drug war initiatives. Because
Yeah.
Christie could be like maybe trying to blunt the emergence of more of them, but what he's doing is now authorizing, police initiatives to round up users, put them on the internet, and subject them to public humiliation and arrest them. I mean, that's the total opposite of what someone who would genuinely believe the drug war had failed would do.
Absolutely. The public
Well, wait,
humiliation
no.
angle is also
But I mean, other
common.
police departments are doing that because they're for whatever reason, law enforcement feels like it needs to be on fucking social media, and I don't understand it because it
And they
never
do so
works
poorly
out
at
well
it
for them.
too.
Because I remember a story where they did that same thing, Tracy, about, but it wasn't with drugs. I think it was with prostitution sting.
Yeah, they've done it with child
Yeah.
porn stings and stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah,
shaming
so I
people,
think
like locking up people is enough. Shaming them is also what
And
uh,
I think it's because they're bitter because there's so many videos online of them fucking citizens up, and people
yeah.
get mad at that, and people are starting to wake up to the fact that just because they're cops doesn't mean they're good, and that's changing
To say the
the
least.
dynamic again slightly. There's still a long way to go in terms of actually having people think rationally about how the police should act in their communities because they want to be protected. They want to feel safe, and that none of the bad, scary brown people are going to get them. And
Guys,
I don't know.
all
That's
right.
where I get depressed.
Yes. I would talk about the drug war and the cops all day long, but then we would have a truly unwatchable podcast that was hours long, and we can't do that. We cannot do that. We were going to talk about some. Okay, well, we're not going to talk about how the Pope likes the war on drugs. Some hippie he turned out to be. We're not going to talk about how Hillary Clinton did or did not defend a rapist, which is or is not terrible / a bullshit, pointless story. Honestly, I think that we need to wrap up with. Now, I got to change this up a little bit because if I had, a lazy libertarian panel, I could just allude to what we're talking about without too much context. But basically, the last 2 days, a very silly, very irritating libertarian site that was supposed to be devoted to viral content made a list of
Enough said.
sexy libertarian ladies, and then when people were annoyed, made a list of sexy libertarian males, which I accidentally helped with, but I didn't mean to because I didn't realize that my friend was talking to the person who made the list. But the point is, I guess I want to talk about, since this isn't libertarian centric, but like, I don't know. Joe, well, first of all, Joe, to tell us about those lists a little bit, being a libertarian and person who's always telling me to sell out more so that I get more attention for my pieces. Do you have thoughts on these lists, Joe?
Yeah, I do. I mean, it's Austin Peterson who created the site, Liberty Viral Liberty, whatever it is.
Shh, don't promote
Yeah,
it.
he's smart. The problem is he's really smart about this, and he knows how to get people to do things for him. He makes this list of the 20 best-looking libertarian females, and he knows they're all gonna retweet it and post it on their Facebook wall, and then there's gonna be a lot of haranguing and harumphing amongst the other lady libertarians who didn't make the list, and it's gonna be a huge thing, and
I'm sorry, I'm good.
he knew it was gonna happen, and it worked out exactly like he wanted to, and his before failing Liberty Viral site probably got its most hits ever because people like Kathy Reisenwitz and Michelle Fields took the bait. I mean, it was too obvious.
It was too
brilliant
obvious.
by him, but it makes me want to puke.
Well, I mean, all of us here are good writers, by the way. Like, do you guys feel a pressure to ever engage in, like, really, maybe not this clickbaity or this sort of narrow of a niche, but, like, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, of course. The one good thing about the libertarian community, it seems, is that you guys do look into each other. So there is kind of a built-in following, not built-in, but like it's a community. Whereas the rest of us who write just regular shit, I mean, every day I have to think, what's the most fucked up headline I can make that people will click on and share, be like, how dare they, and then read an actual reasonable article and be disappointed and let down. So that's what I do. I mean, I even tried for this one site that I write for, latest.com, because it's mostly liberal audience. I did a 5 craziest things said this week on the right, and usually it was shit like tornadoes caused by gay people. Obama is a Kenyan Muslim transgender. Just crazy stuff
True.
like that. Thinking it was straight clickbait. Like I was giving these people, the best thing to do is to ignore those people, and they were some of my more popular pieces in the beginning. I've stopped doing it because I don't fear for my job as much as I used to. But
I mean, it's just the thing is, and I've been calling it. I tried to call attention to this 2 years ago or so, and was told basically to shut up by a number of people. But I kind of prophesied that the quote-unquote BuzzFeedification of the internet was at that point already underway,
Yeah.
and we see it now trickling out into realms that we would not have predicted even 2 years ago or a year ago, to the point where now that you have a libertarian group emulating the list kind of vehicle for click generation, and it's just causing controversy. But the other thing is that, like, the libertarian community, quote unquote, and I hate that word community, but the libertarian community is very notoriously kind of inward looking and always trying to sort out who's a libertarian, who's doing the right libertarian thing, who made this other libertarian
I have
that,
never heard this critique
libertarian
before.
that.
that
Whereas I
does
think
read
on
everything I've
the
read.
left, there's less of this obsession with, or at least on the putative left, there's less of this obsession with who ascribes to what kind of ideological label. Just because in the past there's so much
Feminists, on the other
sectarian
hand,
infighting on the left that they've kind of renounced that style of infighting.
but feminists, Tracy, have the very same type of ideological testing and sort of, I forget what the horrible Maoist self-criticism thing happening. And libertarians, from the inside, it seems like libertarians are the very worst at this, or the very best at this. And because they, have so little success in the real world, the fact that they spend any time on this at all is sort of, particularly embarrassing.
Yeah, I mean, I find it especially objectionable to make that list. And obviously, the person who made it knew this going into it, knew that it would provoke controversy, as Joe said. But the people on that list are people who are doing work, doing political analysis or reporting, or they're putting a part of themselves into the public arena that is wholly distinct from their physical characteristics. So to drag that in the form of a list just to generate clicks, I think should be, I think it should have been denounced among the women that were on the list if they consider themselves any kind of feminist or even progressive-minded. Not even have to consider themselves a feminist. It's demeaning whichever way you spin it.
Yeah,
But
I mean, like,
it's again catering to the worst impulses of the internet, and if anything, that needs to be fought against because it's so alluring.
But
Did any of you guys read the comments? 'Cause
I tried not to.
they're fantastic.
there's no way they weren't going to comment on it, though. They knew,
Yeah.
I mean, Peterson knew who he was targeting.
Well,
No.
what bothers me, I'm gonna say that what bothers me is the polite thank yous about being included on the list, which some of them did and some of them didn't. But honestly, like Kathy Reisenwitz, who I like in real life, and I don't want to pile on some of the silly critiques that she's gotten, but her response was sort of like, well, this is demeaning, but it helps me get sort of attention for my career.
Right.
Which is maybe commendably honest, but at the same time, it reminded me of this one Onion article. Everything a woman does now empowering, and talks about how shopping and gaining or losing weight, or like doing everything a woman does is now empowering, which is like a really brutal critique of third wave feminism, where yeah, choice is top tier and should be for a libertarian in particular, but like, does that really end the discussion? And if so, what's the point? It's like when I read a Jezebel article that basically defended plastic surgery for any reason whatsoever. Yeah, you chose it, congratulations, but what's the point of Jezebel if it's just
You could have stopped right there.
You know, I
Bazing!
think, libertarians talk a lot about wanting to be more inclusive and wanting to penetrate different demographics aside from just white people who tend to be the ones that comprise 95% of the attendance of their conferences,
Mhm.
if not more. So I think the fact that this kind of stuff, so this, if this happened among like in feminist circles on the left, it would have caused a huge uproar. There would have been like Twitter ostracizations. People would have, there would have been long, reflective think pieces written on what happened, etc. Whereas among the libertarian circle, because it's kind of more rarefied and it's more insulated, it's kind of like there's maybe one or two people chime in, but it's not gonna turn into anything that actually prompts any degree of genuine self-scrutiny upon the part of the movement, quote unquote. So I think it's kind of I think the dynamics at play there and the fact that people are kind of to consider it acceptable or justifiable to basically, I don't like tossing around the feminist buzzwords that much, but, it is an objectification of women to say that they're hot and they happen to be libertarians. So here's a list. And I think the dynamics that kind of went into the reaction to the list kind of get to why libertarians don't appeal much to women and to other demographics that they've been trying to reach out to.
I mean, from what I saw, the men were a lot more upset than the actual women who were on the list. I didn't hear a single peep from any of them about, maybe this was, a bad list.
Well, you could see them not wanting to be, they might not want to be thought of as whiny or petulant about it. So you could see there being kind of a pressure from that angle.
Yeah, I mean, I saw that
if the
Julie
people not
kind
on
of
the
diplomatically ignored it, which I appreciated.
In order to any inroads to be made, someone on the list would have to say something, because if the 29th person who didn't make the list says something that's going to be, sour grapes, he didn't get on the list. Somebody should have stepped up, and it should have been.
And this is just something. I mean,
it's a no-win situation, really.
That's
how
why
emotional those gals are. Let's be honest.
Right. So true.
And anybody would just have to admit that this is an issue that would never even occur to men to even have to grapple with at all. So
yeah, I mean,
it is definitely disproportionate on women, and you don't have to be necessarily a feminist to acknowledge that, but you have to, I think, just acknowledge reality in that there's this disproportionate burden that women writers are being shouldered with, that they're even in this conversation to begin with without voluntarily entering it.
Right, like the fact that I assume that women didn't all give permission for multiple Facebook photos to be used on this list, and the fact that the male follow-up list was written by Peterson, a heterosexual, and it had more, there was sort of an implied joke that they were doing a follow-up male list at all,
right.
So that the women don't get too offended, and so that we're equal.
Now, because I never am going to get that time back, I'm not going to read either of these lists.
Good man.
What were the male ones? Were they actually did they just take 20 libertarians that they liked and said this guy's hot and talk about? I can't imagine they talked about anything really, just other than here's the pictures of these people.
It was just a tongue in cheek. The male thing was just tongue in cheek, whereas the women one you could actually tell some thought went into ranking you genuinely based on how hot they thought they were.
Yeah, like the one.
Nick Gillespie was number 2 in the male list, right? So. I mean, I'm not saying he's not an attractive man, but for amongst the young Liberty crowd, I don't think the ladies are gonna necessarily be falling over themselves for him at number 2.
As someone who's. Oh, go ahead, Lucy.
Okay, well, I mean, it comes back to one of the more interesting and flawed feminist books I ever dabbled in was Female Chauvinist Pigs, which was written in the mid-aughts at the peak of oh god, they're making songs for 6-year-olds, what do we do sort of panic. And the book is kind of down on sex workers, which I strongly dislike, but it raises an interesting point about this sort of the sort of box that women get put into, which to me applies in the you have to laugh when you get put on a list like this sort of thing. Like if you make too much of a comment about it, you're not one of the boys.
Yeah.
And the boys are gonna sort of they want you to run with them, but they also want to talk about your tits basically. And that's the box that you're put in.
And they want you to put up with it and not object at all.
Yeah, because you're not like those uptight other bitches, basically.
To be fair, tits are fantastic, and I'll talk about them all day.
That's
But
fine.
my point is, who is this for? Is what I don't understand. Like, is it meant to attract, people like me who just, I like the whole legalized drugs things. Still kind of cool with the Department of Education, like us people.
It's meant to attract the
or is it trying to
hardcore
be
libertarian.
Yeah,
Right.
it's a circle jerk of outrage.
Right. It's
I
meant to
realize I'm
attract
feeling it.
anyone who would brainlessly click it. I mean, it's not. I don't think it might be like loosely aimed at a libertarian demographic, but the point of viral content is that you want people to just instinctively click on stuff, whatever their predispositions.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, Austin Peterson wants to be the libertarian with BuzzFeed, so all the libertarians are going to click on this,
I mean, and another
even the women, because it's all going to get retweeted by the people on the list, and then other women are going to see it, and they're going to be, oh, am I on this list? Because it's a small group
To
anyway.
be fair, I get way more retweets and Facebook shares of people who think I'm an asshole than actually are like, hey,
that
good job.
does help. I mean, the BuzzFeedification of media, which Tracy referenced like 100 years ago in this debate, and which we should wrap up soon. Another thing that comes out of that, though, is I don't know if BuzzFeed has ever officially said this, but basically the cat gifs are subsidizing their occasional forays into actual journalism, including long form stuff, and some of it's dull, but some of it is actually quite good. It was better when Michael Hastings was alive and stuff, but there's still they have some solid longer
His new
content
book
on
is
there.
great, by the way.
I'm sorry?
His new book, The Last Magazine, I read it in a night. It was really good.
Oh yeah, I want to pick that up. I mean, is there something though to be said about subsidizing, propping up the stuff, the long form or the in depth or the investigative stuff with really silly viral bullshit?
Yeah, I mean, that's the way media has operated for eons, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the classified sections of newspapers are what subsidized the reporting, in decades past. And because the reporting aspects of a newspaper is not what generated any revenue. It was selling ads and classifieds. So I think
That's a service. That's
similar
not
to the thing
actively.
at BuzzFeed now, but just for a different kind of dynamic. And I think the difference is that it morphs the general conception of what journalism is in a way that the classified section in a newspaper wouldn't have, because there was this understood separability.
Mhm.
Whereas the ethos of BuzzFeed is, first of all, they want to do all the journalism has to abide by the mantra of no haters,
Okay,
which is why they were castigated for launching a book review section that would have no negative book reviews. And I think there's definitely on occasion they'll do some journalism that has merit and is appropriately critical, but at the same time you have to kind of be cognizant of that. Lingering behind it is this ethos that's been mandated from the top CEO on down of producing this airy, light, kind of easily clickable content that you don't want to bum people too much out about. So and I think when that becomes a major consideration with the journalism you're producing, it has problematic implications. And I think I think the way that the BuzzFeed is kind of diluting the journalistic market is really. I was sounding the alarm on this like 2 years ago, and I realized it was fruitless, and I didn't want to be pegged as like a BuzzFeed obsessive.
Mm.
But I really
That's
feel
right.
like it's
You
been
were
borne out.
obsessed. Sorry. You were really mad at BuzzFeed for a minute there. I remember that. And I was like, oh, Tracy, what are you complaining
borne
about?
out. I mean, I feel like everything I predicted has come true. Like, I wish it hadn't, but I feel like it really did.
But arguably, it's still better than if there was no long form anything. I mean, I don't know.
Sure.
And all writing in journalism had to be done for free. I mean, I get paid from a clickbait site.
Yeah. There you go.
And again, what I do is, like I said, I try to do a terrible headline, things like "white privilege, real or crazy," and then hopefully people read it and go, "Oh shit, he thinks it's real and he's being nuanced." And by that time, the site's made their money, and maybe someone keeps reading, and sweet,
Yeah.
But the other thing is that, like, this happens on Vice every now and then, and other articles can blow up not because they're listicles or they're a funny gif or they have a stupidly sensational headline. It's because they're actually good content,
Mm-hmm.
and that still does draw a lot of clicks. I mean, yeah, you have to kind of tailor it to social media in a sense because
But that doesn't mean you have to be
95% of the traffic is coming from Facebook,
Mm-hmm.
but the harm that BuzzFeed has done is kind of inculcated this belief that in order to be successful, you have to adopt their formula, whereas
Right.
there are other formulas available that are more conducive to producing quality content.
Yeah, like the day that GIFs started being put in the content of other blogs, like on what am I thinking of? Like The Gloss, which is sort of a Jezebel-esque but sometimes less annoying lady blog, and it's like and like Jezebel also, like any kind of even like glossy other stuff where they put GIFs in the actual body of the piece, and it's expanded into other places. That was a bad sign to me, because again, if like a BuzzFeed list that is truly just like a bunch of stupid GIFs and 2 sentences, at least you know exactly what that is. When
The other
that
thing about
creeps into more text-heavy stuff that also like needs a GIF in it, that starts to annoy me.
The other thing that what part of what was informing my critique back in the day of BuzzFeed is that I kind of discerned.
Sit back, Tracy. We don't want to see your forehead.
Yeah, what I discerned was that they were kind of personifying the objectivity doctrine, but for a new tech-savvy generation, right? So they're not supposed to come down on either side of a political issue. They're supposed to remain impartial. They're focused on the virality of their content, and that's paramount. So they have to. It's an offshoot of the New York Times objectivity, but just marketed as fresher. Whereas that actually makes it more pernicious because you're kind of popularizing it among a new demographic who might think that they've transcended the old kind of stodgy objectivity of the past, but in reality are just kind of affirming it in another incarnation today.
But
Right.
objectivity is also bullshit, guys. Right? I mean,
Oh,
Right, that's
Lord,
right.
that's a whole other thing, guys.
Right, that's
Yeah.
the point of my criticism. That it's
Yeah,
both-
we should.
yeah,
God, we should start an
producing
entirely media sassing based podcast. That would actually be really good.
call it. It
I'd
can
be-
called
I'd be available for
Dr.
it.
Wall talks about the media, and what she says will melt your heart.
No, it won't be called that. Joe, do you have final words on this? And I'm going to wrap up. It's been.
It sounds like I've hated BuzzFeed for not even as long as Michael Tracy, so that's impressive. I'm glad that there's someone else out there who also feels the way I feel. I mean, it literally, I refuse to click on it. I refuse to get to it. I hate Andrew Kaczynski. I hate Ben Smith. Like, they're literally, it's like they're.
I'm gonna get in trouble.
With
We're all gonna
dead
get in
cat
trouble, it's
gifs.
fine.
Like, I mean, it's fine. It's the future of news, but
We're all doomed. Yeah.
it's our, it's people's own fault. We're the ones
They have
clicking on
so
it.
much money, it's unbelievable.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it is people's own fault.
And
Well, I mean, honestly, like the most optimistic thing, like takeaway from this to me might be that you could sneak in a solid piece underneath a sort of
there's good
headline.
stuff on it.
But I don't want to do that either. Like, I legitimately am going to fail at journalism because of how much I don't want to have a headline that tells you how you're going to feel about what I wrote, or actually like hides the content of the piece upwardly
Right.
style instead of like enlightens what you were. Like, I can't do it.
That's
Like, I
why
can't.
I'm glad when
It
I
drives me
don't
insane.
have to write headlines.
Yeah.
With-
Yeah.
Another
You guys
problem with
seen Clickhole
BuzzFeed.
yet?
What's that?
Clickhole, the Onion.
Oh, that
Oh,
thing's
it's so
masterful.
good.
That's masterful.
America's been crying out for Clickhole. It's a
Yeah.
national treasure.
That
so
is
good.
an amazing tagline. That sounds incredibly dirty. On that note, I really think that we should probably wrap this up. The final thing, This is like our longest podcast ever. We have this is terrible.
What form is this going to be available in? Like, how do people consume?
We talk about that later, Tracy. All right. The final thing is, of course, Better Than Politics, which sometimes is the longer segment, but today I literally just want to hear one or two things, like a couple sentences, what you've been enjoying in the past week that is not related to politics. I basically have just been listening to Old Crow Medicine Show bootlegs and rewatching Game of Thrones with my mom. Joe?
World Cup. I don't care about any of the politics. I don't care if they destroy the Amazon rainforest. I'm still going to watch it.
That's a bummer, but okay. Josh? Anything?
Yeah, this week for whatever reason I've been watching a lot of like dolphin and whales are intelligent and emotional videos
Nice.
on YouTube.
Cool.
Fantastic.
I also recommend octopus videos because they're awesome. Tracy?
All right.
I've enjoyed the unseasonably cool June weather, at least in the New York area. Because yesterday, I think, was the first day where you walk outside and you had a sense, okay, I could see this being unbearably hot if I stayed out here too long. But every other day in like the past week, it's been a very, very nice weather combination that I feel very grateful for, and that's not politics related, unless you're talking about HARP and weather control and so forth. Let's bracket that.
That's another. I'm actually going to do a conspiracy panel at some point. It's going to be awesome. All right, guys. That was a ridiculously long panel, but it was a really good one. We had Michelle briefly. I forget if she said anything, but she still was here for a while looking stoic. All right, Joe, Josh, and Michael Tracy, thank you very much for joining me today. Oh, wait. All right, we've gone so long. You know what? Quick, plug your content. Josh, where can people read your works? Go.
Latest.com and issuehawk.com. All with
Sexy.
one word.
Okay. Michael Tracy, where can the people read your works?
Best thing to do would probably be to follow me on Twitter. If you don't want to follow me on Twitter, you could just scan my Twitter for updates on various works. But that's where it's all kind of centralized.
Awesome. And as always, people can read my stuff on Rare and Anti-War and Vice and thestagblog.com, where I usually link to the aforementioned sites. Joe never wants to promote anything, but you should still look at all the shiny websites he makes sometimes, like the Stag blog. My lord, this took a long time. Join us next time, hopefully next week, for Politics for People Who Hate Politics, episode 6. This panel is too long. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Josh. Thank you, Tracy. Bye, everybody.